If this goes on, don't panic. Bringing hope to the world through speculative fiction.
Hello and welcome to episode 14. In this episode, we will be interviewing engineer and author SB Divya. So, due to some last minute issues, I'm going to be doing this episode myself. But real quick before we get started, I just want to let you all know I will be at the Flight of Foundry conference coming up. We have a live episode with Organichavwe Donald Ekpeki. He's an editor and writer and was just nominated for a Nebula. You may have heard of his anthology, Dominion. Also be on a panel called Podcast Care and Feeding, How to Manage Expectations, Grow Your Audience, and Keep Momentum. And finally, I will be moderating a panel called Behind the Scenes with a Mic, Managing an Audio Fiction Podcast. And our guest for tonight, Divya, will also be on the panel. So let's get started.
Hey all, you know that here at If This Goes On, we believe that a rising tide lifts all boats. Life is not a zero-sum game.
Aurelia Leo Publishing believes the same thing. If you haven't heard of them, they're a publisher that focuses on disabled, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and other storytellers of color.
They intend to pursue their mission further with their new podcast, Aurelia.
Twice a month, Aurelia will feature reviews, interviews, and short fiction produced by or about disabled, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and other storytellers of color, hosted by our friend Zelda Knight.
They are kicking off with interviews of N.J. Ember in a series of short stories by Edmund Chusel and Miko Rahala, published in the Infinite Metropolis collection.
If you want to hear more about disabled, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and other storytellers of color, check them out at aureliapodcast.com, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts.
Hey everybody, today our guest is SB Divya. She is a lover of science, math, and fiction, and the Oxford comma. She enjoys subverting expectations and breaking stereotypes whenever she can. Divya is the Hugo and Nebula nominated author of Machinehood, Runtime, and the short story collection Contingency Plans for the Apocalypse and Other Situations. She co-edits the weekly science fiction podcast Escape Pod with Murr Lafferty. Her short stories have been published at various magazines such as Analog, Uncanny, and Tor.com, as well as anthologies including the Golan's Book of South Asian Science Fiction and Where the Stars Rise. She holds degrees in computational neuroscience and signal processing, and she worked for 20 years as an electrical engineer before becoming an author. Find out more about her at www.sb, B as in boy, Divya, Divya.com, or on Twitter as @DivyaTweets. Okay, so welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So we're doing like a solo thing today, which is a little unusual. Usually we have two co-hosts here, kind of tag teaming. So our poor listeners are just have to listen to me the entire time. Let me just say, first of all, I loved Machinehood. It was so good.
Thank you. I'm super glad to hear that.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And we had Malka Older on, I don't know, about 6 months ago. And I think you and her styles of looking at the future, even though your books are very different, there was definitely some overlap there. And I don't know. I feel like the two of you are really leading the way on this. I'm calling it neo-cyberpunk.
Yeah. I think that's a fair label. Malka and I had a great talk at the Strand bookstore virtually at the beginning of this month. And I love her stuff.
Yeah. I actually managed to catch just a little bit of it. I think I caught the last half. It was a good conversation.
Yep. I was really glad. It was the first time I had a chance to actually sit down and talk with her I think between our respective families and being on opposite coasts of the US, we just haven't crossed paths at conventions. So it was nice to have an excuse like, hey, my first book is coming out. Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah. That's so awesome. And I'm really hoping at ChiCon next year, since it's kind of in the middle of the country, everybody from both sides will come to it. And so we can kind of meet everybody.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Yeah. So off of the tangent now. I really love the complexity that you brought to your world building. The socio-political aspects of your novel were just so well thought out, in my opinion. We had P. Shelley Clark on a while back, and he had talked about world building in the fantasy context and how he used history a lot. I feel like for science fiction, that might be a little bit different, though, because for some of the stuff, there's not really a historical analogy. For example, like AI or printing drugs in your kitchen as they do in your novel. Or do you disagree with that point of view? And if you don't use history to help you world build, what do you use?
I do use some history. I use a combination of looking at what's happened in the past and what's happening at the cutting edge of technological and scientific development today. And then I try to extrapolate forward, combining those two trends to see, what might happen in the upcoming decades. So for your specific examples, the AI part of the story, while the technical side of the AI stuff came mostly from my own experience working in that industry, the effect on the socio-political situation, especially in terms of the labor conflicts that are in this novel, that I modeled a lot after what happened about 100 years ago during the Industrial Revolution and how it upended, the way we live and work and, the dawn of universal public education in a lot of places, the shift from agriculture to factories and then desk jobs. I took that and kind of mapped it to, what kind of similar upheaval are we going through today with automation of a different sort? And how might that drive changes in this upcoming century? So for the pills that people take, I was considering the evolution of computer technology specifically, and the fact that biotech right now happens, in these highly specialized laboratories with people that are very specifically skilled and, bulky specialized equipment, much like what happened with computing originally. And, we had transistors in the 50s, but you had room-sized computers, you had punch cards, you had people with extremely specialized knowledge. But over time, it miniaturized, simplified, and became accessible first to, a wide swath of engineers, and today to everybody with a smartphone in their pocket, right? So I started thinking along those lines of, what if that happens to biotech and pharmaceuticals in this upcoming century? What if that's the next big thing? And I feel like that's plausible because it's an area that's really ripe for development and broadening of applications. It's one of those unexplored territories that we're learning more and more about. So I was like, what if that gets miniaturized and then, almost to a consumer level where someone with the appropriate training could genetically engineer a bacteria at home, or who could build a nano machine to interface with your cardiovascular system or your neurological system and then print it at home, much in the way that, anyone can learn to code and do incredibly sophisticated things at home today.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think, miniaturization of the computer came about because of space, exploring space. I wonder what it would take for us to invent, miniaturization of biotech.
Maybe
So I don't expect you to answer that.
I'm gonna hazard. So one of the things I slipped into Machinehood in terms of, while I was world building and figuring out how we get to 2095 from 2017 when I started drafting it, I was filling in these very rough sort of decades of history between now and then. And one of the things I posited, and note this was 4 years ago now, was a couple decades of widespread pandemics. And that combined with people trying to compete with robots by basically turning themselves into cyborgs was what ultimately drives this biotechnology revolution for Machinehood and the miniaturization and making it more broadly available. Because if you have repeated pandemics, thanks to climate change, you need to put more social resources into fighting them off, right? So it becomes more of an industry. And I think as part of that, naturally things will start to gain efficiencies, economically speaking and technologically speaking. Now, I'm hoping that that's not what actually happens. And this is, another once a century type of thing. But I do remember when I was researching for the world building for this, reading more than one futurist talking about the possibility that we are going to have, more widespread pandemics and new pathogens that are going to challenge us thanks to global warming and climate change.
Interesting. Well, a couple routes I feel like I could go here. Well, let's go back to the culture thing here for a second. I kind of really want to hit on this. You explore religion a lot in this book. And just touching back to what we were talking about earlier, you and Malka had a conversation, and she brought up religion too, about how science fiction often avoids it or goes around it, or maybe invents something completely new, right? But you've incorporated Buddhism, Catholicism, whatever Welga is, atheist or agnostic.
Atheist, yep.
Yeah. And Hinduism, right? Which, by the way, I absolutely loved that aspect and how all of these cultures came together, even in just one family, How did you navigate that space between all those religions with these characters when you were writing your book?
For me, this is reality in a lot of ways. I live in Southern California. It's a very multicultural environment. I have friends and coworkers who are just about every religion you can imagine. So, and I'm in a, mixed culture marriage myself, though my husband and I are both atheists effectively. But, I come from a Hindu tradition. He comes from the Christian tradition. We have friends who are Jewish, who are Muslim. So the idea that somehow all religion is going to go away in the next 75 years is fairly preposterous to me. I don't think that's going to happen. I know, on the curve and the trend is people are generally getting less religious. The number of agnostics and atheists or people who are just, non-denominational is growing. But it's such a deep part of so many lives, especially within my friends and family, that I can't see it, disappearing in 2 or 3 generations. And it does inform a lot of our thinking in ways that we aren't always conscious of, I feel, both in terms of morality and ethics, but also even just in terms of law and politics and culture. And so I didn't feel like I could tell a story that's specifically exploring things like the ethics of how we deal with AI and how we deal with each other and how we find fulfillment in our lives without incorporating some amount of religion, because that's where a lot of people look for answers to those kinds of questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I do wish my local area was a little more diverse than it is. Most everybody around us are either from a Christian tradition or, not religious. I myself consider myself to be a secular Buddhist, which means that I don't really believe in the religious side of stuff so much as I enjoy and think the philosophy of Buddhism helps me in my life. Things like mindfulness, for example, and meditation. And I usually don't even bring it up, because bring it up and people start looking at you sideways here. You know what I mean? So it's really interesting to hear that, and I am glad that there's places where this is happening.
Oh yeah.
So just going with the Buddhist thing, because obviously it's something I very much enjoy. Just really, I want to take a little tangent here and ask you, do you know of any other novels or stories that focus on Buddhist characters as much as yours does?
Oh, that's a tough question.
Sadly tough, right? I can think of one, but I can't remember the name of it.
Yeah, I mean, to your earlier point, and Malka's, not a lot of science fiction tends to incorporate actual living religions. Buddhism. Yeah, nothing off the top of my head. Especially not where they're explicitly calling it out. I feel like the philosophies and the underpinnings of it show up here and there, especially in science fiction that asks big existential questions. Even in pop culture, I'm thinking of like Battlestar Galactica, right? Where, they do kind of delve into some of these ideas of the nature of the universe and rebirth and what does it mean. Yeah, I don't know. I can't think of one that I'm sure they're out there. Somebody's going to listen to this podcast and be like, "Oh, how could you forget?"
Right.
Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I'm sure that probably happens in the every episode.
But yeah, nothing springs to mind. No, for the Buddhism in Machinehood, I drew on my own knowledge because Buddhism was born from Hindu philosophy and traditions in ancient India, and a decent amount of research and reading, especially into the feminine side of Buddhism, which has a really interesting and complex history.
That's interesting. Can you suggest any books about that?
Yes, but I'm going to have to look it up and send it to you afterwards for your show notes, because I don't remember off the top of my head. It's like I said, it's been about 4 years since I did the research, but there was specifically one that was authored by an American Buddhist woman, but she was kind of tracing the history of women, especially women monks in the Buddhist tradition, and how much of a challenge it is for them, but how it's, there too, the sexism plays in, just like with, seems like with most of the dominant religions. But a lot more women are stepping forward to become monks and abbots and leaders these days.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So we'll try and put those in our notes, everybody. Look out for that. So let's move on to science. AI specifically.
Yeah, my favorite.
My father often brings up AI. So he alternates between two things. A, he's terrified that the AIs are coming for humanity and going to destroy us all. Or, alternatively, a singularity will happen and we will all become machines and live forever. Is any of that realistic at all? Like, are artificial intelligences ever going to be truly, I'm not putting this in quotes here, smart as humans?
Ever is a very long time, and I am not a believer in making absolute declarations about much of anything, especially when it comes to science. I think anytime anyone says this will never happen scientifically, they will inevitably be proven wrong at some point down the line. But not in the near future. I don't think we're going to get I don't think we're going to get conscious, self-aware AI the way human beings and other life forms are. I think smart is a very loaded word, and there are people working on, different modalities to achieve what they call generalized artificial intelligence, which is basically a system that can be taught to do more than one thing. Because right now, most of the AI systems that we are working with can be trained on one task and they can learn to do it very, very well. But if you ask them to do anything else, they'll stumble, and it's not even necessarily easy to retrain it to do that without, completely reconfiguring and possibly even reconstructing certain aspects of the system. So, yeah, I think that the grail everybody's searching for right now and chasing in terms of actual machine intelligence systems is this, general purpose intelligence. And that could behave smartly in the way that a human being is, right? Like maybe we can teach it, how to play games and how to vacuum a floor and how to do the laundry and to drive your car, right?
So like critical thinking skills, basically.
I wouldn't even go so far as to say critical thinking skills. I would just say the capability to learn and perform more than one type of task.
I do agree. The word...
Because that's already pretty complicated.
I agree. You're right. The word smart is loaded. I'm an educator by profession, and people will say to me, oh, well, my IQ test says I'm whatever. And I said, well, first of all, even if you consider the IQ test to be completely legitimate, it really only measures one type of intelligence, and people don't even really understand what that means. People don't really understand what types of intelligence are. You know what I mean? There's no real definition of these things. I mean, there's working models that we use, but none of this stuff has been defined in some kind of what's the word I want to use? Some kind of pragmatic way.
Yeah, I agree. And we don't have a science of intelligence where we can point to a set of equations or, a simulation or a model that says this replicates in a predictable and repeatable fashion how intelligence works, right? We all have kind of our own intuitive senses. Everyone's got definitions that are slightly different depending on who you talk to and what you're talking about. And that's where things get tricky and things get fuzzy. And it was that fuzzy zone that I was really interested in exploring in this novel, because how do you know you have a thing until you can define a thing? Can you define the negative? Somebody asked me that recently. They're like, well, do you know that we haven't achieved artificial general intelligence? And it's like, kind of, because you can point at the system and say, this is where, it fails and a human succeeds, right? You can do it by example. But I don't have necessarily an abstract definition to say, at this point, something is intelligent and at this point, it's not, right? And I don't think that it's truly a binary like that anyway, not in living systems. And I don't think it's going to be that way for our artificially constructed systems.
Absolutely.
Either.
I think even amongst humans, I mean, I happen to be good at one thing and you happen to be good at something else, but there are shades between there, right?
Yeah, exactly. And even the shades between what we call talent versus skill, right? In terms of what do you have innately and what can you acquire and can someone catch up? There's all those kinds of questions. And how much does your upbringing, your socioeconomic status, your access to education in your early years, how you're parented, there's this huge amount of complexity in terms of determining what you're able to do as an adult. And this is where things get really interesting for the people who are building AI systems today, because computers can do certain types of tasks, thousands of times, sometimes millions of times faster than a human being can, right? So the computer can play 1,000 games of chess by the time you're done drinking your cup of coffee. No human being can do it because we're limited by our both our neurobiology, but also our musculature, the fact that we have to sit there and move the pieces and think about it. So in terms of coming up with a human-like intelligence, which I think is really what we're chasing right now, one of the big questions in my mind is it going to take human-like timescales to teach the machine? Because somebody has to teach it. And while we can compile lots and lots of different types of data, none of it is going to mimic, the experience of moving through the world and physically interacting with it, right? Or we have to build an insanely complex simulation, something like what they have in Westworld, except that technology is a ways off still. So, yeah, so these are some of the questions, the engineers and scientists who are in this field are really grappling with today is like what are the building blocks of a general intelligence, and then how do we teach it in a way that keeps it general and doesn't immediately and quickly hyper-specialize it to the particulars of the data that we're feeding it. Right.
So I feel like this comes into the ethics portion of the AI discussion, which you knew was coming, right?
Yeah.
And I read a review of your book this morning that was talking about, that was discussing your book in the light of Asimov's 3 laws. A few years ago, I interviewed a machine learning ethicist. And of course, we talked about Asimov's laws, because how could you not at that point, right?
Right.
And he was discussing how Asimov's laws were just really not up to any kind of realistic level, because you could say, robots can never harm humans, right? I believe that's one of Asimov's laws. But, and then we get into the trolley problem. Okay, so if we have, the old lady crossing the street or the child crossing the street, and one of them is going to get hit by the robot, which one does the robot save?
Even before the trolley problem, I think you have the definition of harm, which, Asimov does play with some of these things and explore some of these things in his original short stories.
Right.
And language is very tricky. But I think I don't know if you want to ask me a specific question or just have me jump in and start talking about my opinion of that particular framing of AI and ethics.
So let me ask you this then. How do you feel about Asimov's laws? We'll start there. And then, what do you really think the ethics for an AI will look like?
So my feeling on Asimov's laws is they made a lot of sense for the time period that he wrote them in, but they are not particularly practical because, again, of the fuzziness of the language. It's not something that you can easily program. And B, I find them deeply problematic because if you assume that at some point the intelligent robot achieves some amount of self-awareness and sentience, then Asimov's laws basically codify slavery, and that's a bad thing as far as, modern ethics and morality is concerned. So I'm a firm believer in, begin as you mean to go along. So I would love to see ethics in that sort of far future, sentient AI sense start to consider even today that the way we should construct these systems is to give them an ethical and moral framework in which to operate and make decisions in the world. Because the trolley problem happens and we all make split-second decisions, right? And it's driven by, the complexities of our neurobiology, our biochemistry, our trained behaviors throughout our lives, epigenetics. It's complex, right? But when that moment comes, we react. We don't even often have time to think about it. We're just going to make a choice. And it may or may not be the best choice in any given circumstance. And there may not be an actual best choice anyway. So what we need to do is empower the artificial intelligences to make those same kinds of decisions, right? And I think the way we do it socially as creatures is by teaching each other, laws, morality, ethics, right? And here again comes in religion and philosophy, because that is one avenue in which people learn how to make these sort of choices. I don't really want to give robots religion.
I was just going to ask you about that.
I think coming into it as an atheist, I'm not really necessarily a fan of telling the robots because God said. I don't think that's much better than because humans said so, you should do this. I think it would be better to conceive of these building blocks in a generalized intelligence and decision-making system that incorporate what we understand about ethics and moral choices and the consequences thereof. So in practical, near term, like where do I think AI and ethics are going? We have other very, very pressing concerns with the actual systems that we have today, which are nowhere close to being, generalizable, much less sentient or self-aware. So I think the more immediate problems in AI and ethics have to do with how they are applied to human beings and our interactions with these AIs. And even there, though, I think, there is an opportunity to start contemplating legal frameworks, right, in terms of what rights do we give and what responsibilities do we give to the people who build these systems, to the people who compile the data sets for these systems, and then to the people who deploy these systems and in what ways they choose to deploy them. And I think that's the quagmire we're in right now. And, we need to find our way out of that. It's nice in the back of our minds, I think, to consider the long term as well, not only the sentient self-aware machines, but also the concept of the singularity and the merging of human and machine, and the fact that, we're going to have an assortment of different types of intelligent life. And again, the boundaries have the potential to be very, very fuzzy as time goes on. So we need to think of the broader context when we start conceiving of how to deal with, very, very complex intelligent systems that we have to interact with on a daily basis.
Yeah, I'm so fascinated about that point in time. Fascinated with that point in time. I just the idea of having people and machines tied together in a way where you can't tell them apart. I don't know. It just opens up this world of possibility, really,
Yeah, we're pretty close. I saw a picture today. I was reading an article about schools reopening, and I saw this picture of a high school where they were showing the lunchroom.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a very long time since I've been in high school. And so, there's these round tables with 4 chairs, and they've got their space, they're spaced apart, right? And they have like little plexiglass dividers, but the kids weren't talking to each other. In this photograph, which is like this top-down picture, every single head is bowed. And at first I thought that they were like depressed and resting their head on their arms, like on the table. And then I realized, no, they're all like crouched over their phones, because that's the one time of day, I guess, they're allowed to actually take out and use their phones. All of them are on their phones. Not one of them in this entire picture, and there were probably about 20 kids in this picture, not one of them is talking to each other. And it just struck me at that point that, we have already almost become inseparable from the machine in our hand. So many people have, right? Like we joke about it, but this really shows you, I think, how the upcoming generations don't see this as something separate. This is like as essential to them, I think, as sleeping and, well, I'm just going to say showering, but teenagers.
Totally fair.
Yeah. And so like, I think if you gave them the option to safely graft the abilities of a smartphone onto their bodies in a permanent or at least semi-permanent fashion, they would do it, because why not? This way they don't have to be hunched over looking at the thing. It's just there as part of their everyday reality. And so that's where I feel like, while most of us are dependent on, lots of types of technology that have built up over millennia at this point, the digital aspect is just so clear because it's portable, it's small, and it can do so much for us that we struggle to live without it, right? I don't know if you do much outdoorsy stuff, but I like to go hiking and backpacking. And I used to insist that all the electronic devices be left in the car when my family and I go out for a hike. Now I'm like, okay, we can bring, a phone or maybe two to take pictures, right? But the majority of the time it should stay in your pocket.
That's your camera now, though. That's
yeah. Phones
are just as good as cameras, unless you're going pro.
Right. And even then, the phones are sometimes very, very good. I think my camera phone is as good as my DSLR, except for very specific types of portraiture and shots that I want to take. But the funny thing to me is like the instant we're back in the car, all of us are like on the devices, mobile hotspot, whatever it takes. And when we are out of range, it puts us on edge. It's like, oh my gosh, like we can't see the map. We don't know where we are. Where is our next pit stop? Where is the gas station? Like 100 things that you take for granted as being at your fingertips are suddenly not there. And it's disconcerting. Yeah. And so I feel like that integration has already started happening. It's just subtle and it's still, external. But in terms of our psyche, I think it's already integrated for many, many people.
It's so fascinating that you think now is one of those moments where it's just starting to happen. Because I had never really thought about that. I mean, I finally, actually, just in the last week, I finally put some real money down on a phone. Finally. Because before I would always buy something that worked and was okay, but was, more budget-minded. Right. But in the last couple of weeks, I finally was like, you know what? I'm sick of having to worry about my phone's memory. I'm sick of this. I'm sick of that. I'm just buying a nice damn phone. And I finally got one. And just hearing you say all that, and I'm sitting here thinking, oh man, okay, I've got Venmo, so I got some financial stuff on here, right? Like, I've got my podcast, so half my books are on here. All this stuff, this is how I talk to all of my co-hosts. Yeah. You know what I mean? This is how I do basically everything, except for my job.
And even that, for a lot of people, like my spouse is an executive for a tech company, and they do a lot of their communications on Slack. So even when he's not on his computer or in the office, he's got Slack on his phone, and he's always like, oh, ding, someone sent a message, gotta check what's happening, right? Is there a crisis? Is there good news, bad news? So he's working even through his phone. And that's one of the reasons he won't leave it behind when we do go hiking. He's like, what if there's an emergency? Somebody might need me.
Yeah. I can relate.
Yeah,
to that.
I still do it on purpose sometimes because I find that, speaking of mindfulness, it's a lot easier to be mindful when you don't have that device, even in your pocket, like it's just not there. It's nowhere. And especially when I'm lucky enough, I have hiking trails right across the street from my house. So I go on a regular basis. And sometimes, my family will try to reach me and they'll be like, why didn't you answer my message? And it's like, I was out for a walk, contemplating the real world.
Yeah.
And I didn't have my phone. I left it at home.
Yeah. I always have the best times with my kids when I forget about my phone, which never happens during the week, but sometimes on the weekends.
Yeah.
So I hear that you're bothered by pulp culture depictions of AI. What are some good movies, books, and things about AI? And then we'll be done with AI and move on a little bit.
Yeah, that's fine. So one of the good pop culture depictions of AI that is actually very, very positive, even though it's not very realistic, is Star Wars. I was realizing I never mentioned this in, I think in some of my earlier interviews, because we were usually talking about the not so good depictions of AI, of which there are plenty. But the robots and the droids in Star Wars are not evil, right? And many of them are actually not anthropomorphic, which I think is great. All of them, however, seem to be fairly self-aware, which is not realistic per today's technology. But I think that's actually one of the great, at least in the original series, when you're first introduced to the droids, right? They are such personalities and they are such beloved characters in that universe for, I think, that very reason. And it's funny that many of us don't think of that. Like everyone always jumps to Skynet and, Terminator or Ex Machina, which starts out very philosophical and interesting and ends up in like standard Hollywood horror territory. I guess, and even with Westworld, where they tend to ask questions that the situations that they've put them in is like, it's again the enslavement of, right? Versus in Star Wars, they have the control bolt on R2-D2, but for the most part, most of the droids seem to be fairly autonomous and independent and able to kind of operate on their own. They are still owned, which is bothersome.
Yeah.
But they don't necessarily, have that instinct to rise up and rebel. This is just what they're built for. And so that's what they do. And they just accept it as their way of life. In terms of more realistic, near-term depictions, I liked what they did in the movie Her, as far as how the artificial intelligence changes and evolves, and its motivations, through the movie are pretty interesting. Blade Runner has always asked really good questions, and like I said, Battlestar Galactica asked some pretty good questions too.
Okay, don't spoil that one for me. I am just finished the second season of Battlestar Galactica. So
okay, I'm there's no spoilers. I think. I think you start to see it, right away with especially the new Battlestar Galactica and the Cylons looking very human. It really does help explore that question of what is really the difference between the human and the intelligent machine that looks like a human, and should we even care about those differences, and how should we therefore treat them, and how should they treat us, right?
Right, I can totally see it going that way. Well, we should have a Battlestar Galactica episode on and bring you on one day.
I'd have to brush up on it. It's been a while, but yeah, it was a very, very good show in that respect.
Oh man, it's so great. Okay, another tangent. Let me say, so I've been catching up on some older shows, Battlestar Galactica being one of them, and I was just amazed at how good it still is. I thought, I'm like, this is going to be super cheesy. I was going to watch it with my wife. My wife can be very iffy about sci-fi stuff, especially space opera type stuff. And I like chickened out, so I'm like, okay, I'll just watch it on my own. Just thinking it was going to be terrible. It is not. It is very good.
It's not that old, right? When was it made? I can't keep track of these things anymore.
Early 2000s, 2001, 2002, somewhere around there.
Really? It's 20 years old
so.
now? Oh my God, I'm so old. Okay. I'm not so old, but sometimes it feels like that.
I understand completely.
I was going to bring up another show that I just have watched, like, I think a couple episodes. Was recommended to me by a friend on Amazon, called Humans. I don't know if you've seen that one or if you've come across it. That one has these synthetic humanoid robots, and it's not a spoiler because you get it in like the very first episode, but it seems like some of them have been reprogrammed by somebody in order to become more self-aware and desiring, self-actualization and independence, and not to be owned synthetic robots by humans. But I think it's gonna cover a lot of this, very similar sorts of territory and questions about what type of behavior is acceptable and not in terms of human-machine interaction. But the interesting thing to me is, in a lot of these depictions of science fiction, you either get cyborgs or you get robots. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, maybe there's manga or anime somewhere where those are actually mixed. But for whatever reason, we seem to be uncomfortable having both on the same page. And that's where I really, really wanted to emphasize that aspect of Machinehood, even though many of the people are not cyborg in the traditional, like, bulky, exoskeleton style that is in, that is in Machinehood's history, not so much in its present. But they are cyborged by having, electronic parts inside their bodies. And so, and they exist on a spectrum of this kind of Star Wars only. Well, I mean, I guess technically you could argue that Darth Vader is a cyborg. Yeah, and Luke Skywalker is just his hand.
That doesn't count.
It kind of counts, and I think it is cool. And yeah, it is funny that like Star Wars is the one exception for a lot of these things, right? Because Vader really is a cyborg in a lot of ways too, right? Because he can't live without the support of the machines. Yeah, so it's like I think Lucas had a lot of these ideas back then, and I feel like, and this might just be like grouchy old person talking, but I feel like the newer movies, and I'm going chronologically newer, but they don't have as much of these sorts of philosophical and idea-driven aspects to them, right? It became a lot more about special effects and plot and characters, and I think the world had been well established in that first trilogy, and so I feel like we didn't get a lot of new stuff except maybe for the midichlorians. Hesitate to even bring that up.
Oh, here comes the hate mail.
I know. But yeah, Star Wars, that's true. We do have examples of them coexisting. And like I said, I think in things like Ghost in the Shell, right? We have some classic examples in anime and manga and Japanese depictions of science fiction where you get characters who exist on that spectrum, right? Yeah. And I don't feel like we've seen that as much in mainstream American science fiction for whatever reason.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of other than Star Wars is role-playing games, and I would not call that mainstream. At least not mainstream at the size of a movie, All right, so we are getting low on time, so I've got a couple more questions before we wrap up. Will there be a sequel to this book?
There is nothing planned at the moment. That does not mean there won't be a sequel to this book, but there's nothing in the works.
Okay, I'm going to call your publisher and demand one. So put that on my to-do list. Okay.
Yeah, everybody do that so I can write more books.
Well, I will tell you, and I pay attention to this stuff, you're getting a lot of hype, so I think you're doing good.
All right, then maybe there will be a sequel in my
Hopefully.
future. That'd be awesome. I would love to continue to explore this world, or, these kinds of like idea-heavy science fiction books, much like with our discussion of Star Wars, sometimes, you've raised enough questions and introduced enough new ideas that people can run with it. And it's more fun to write a completely new, version of 2095 or whatever, right? That has a very different but equally detailed future with a very different set of ideas.
Sure.
So one or the other, I would love to do.
Well, I know I definitely look forward to that. So getting into those questions that we ask everybody, what gives you hope right now? We're in a time with, climate issues. We've got the rise of Trumpism in the United States, and fascism really all over the globe. And for people who are progressively minded, it's a kind of a tough time. What's keep giving you hope right now?
Vaccines.
I didn't even mention the pandemic.
The one, I was going to say, like, the one thing we've seen from this pandemic is, yes, it's been horrible. People have died. People have gotten very sick. I have friends in both camps. I myself had COVID earlier this year, not on purpose. But the fact that the scientific community rallied, and the fact that socially we actually were willing to dump money into this endeavor to, develop therapies, to find a vaccine, to manufacture and deploy it in just a record amount of time. I was hearing, especially in the early months, that biologists and epidemiologists, virologists, like all of these people were they were talking, across the globe. They were sharing their information, they were collaborating, and they themselves were commenting how they had never experienced this in their entire professional careers, right? This level of information and knowledge sharing. And I thought that was amazing, because the story we often hear is, ruthless competition, right?
Yeah.
And this was not ruthless competition. This was everybody coming together to save lives and end this pandemic. And that's kind of a beautiful thing, right? And it shows that, we have it in us with the right incentives to behave this way. And that definitely gives me hope.
Okay, great. I love hearing people's ideas of hope, because it definitely helps me personally.
Oh, and the kids, I would say. Kids are doing all right in so many good ways, right? Like, mine is 11. I have one. And when I see, like 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th graders, this sort of cohort of kids who have a basic idea of what's going on, who have absorbed ideas of equity, of gender spectrum, of neurodivergence, like all of the things that, we are pushing for as adults, but we sometimes still struggle with to internalize. They have really, started to internalize that. When I, at least again, at this sort of like upper elementary, lower middle school age, I don't see the kind of cliquishness and bullying that, that I experienced and possibly you experienced, right?
Very
like
much.
Nerds are not a thing. Jocks are not a thing. Popular kids are not really a thing anymore. And I'm like, that's kind of amazing. And I think that's progress. And that also gives me a lot of hope.
That is good to hear. Mine are not. My oldest son is he's in 2nd grade this year. And my youngest has not yet started school, but will next year. So I look forward to seeing that, because, my high school life was just Yeah, just ruled by that stuff. And of course, I was a nerd.
Yeah. Yeah. Same. My high school experience was not stellar.
Yes.
It didn't help that I moved from Southern California to Minnesota for high school.
Yeah, sure. All right, well, great. So where can we find you on the web?
You can find out all about my fiction on my website, sbdivya.com. You can get a little teaser for Machinehood at machinehood.com. And if you've read it, I now have behind a password protected page the entirety of the Machinehood manifesto, which is only excerpted in the book. So anyone who has a copy of the book should be able to figure out the password. Just very easy. I did not make it complicated. I thought about it. I was like, how hard a puzzle should I? And I was like, no, it's good enough that you read the book. That makes me happy. So if you're interested, you can go check that out. And then mostly you can find me publicly on Twitter as @Divya's Tweets. I'm also on Instagram, though I'm not as active there, as SB Divya _author.
Fantastic.
Oh, and Escape Pod. As co-editor of Escape Pod, you can go to escapepod.org and get yourself a free science fiction story every week in audio or print.
I won't tell anybody that you forgot Escape Pod, don't worry.
It's like I'm used to thinking about my own stuff, and then I'm like, well, that's my work too,
sure,
right?
Sure, yeah. And do you have any upcoming projects you'd like to talk about?
I'm going to be a guest of honor at Flights of Foundry, a virtual convention coming up in mid-April.
And let me just jump in real quick and say I will be interviewing Divya there as well, as a moderator on a panel.
Yes, we'll be sharing a panel on this lovely format of audio fiction and podcasting. And I got a bunch of other panels. It's a lot, and a coffee clutch and all that good stuff. So I'm very much looking forward to that. That is free, I believe.
Yes, it is.
And is aimed at new creators of various kinds, art, video, games, literary, in any sort of speculative genre.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed you coming on the show, and that was fun.
Yeah, thanks for the great discussion and for having me here.
Okay, and that was our interview with SB Divya. For me, the conversation about AI and ethics really stuck out in this episode. Again, I've been having some version of that conversation on and off for years, and it always hovers around Asimov's laws. I guess that's partially my fault, as I tend to bring it up, but I feel like this interview put the last nail in the coffin of Asimov's laws for me. Maybe those were a good starting point, but now it's time to move on and think about how you're actually going to hold things like algorithms and robots responsible, or hold their owners responsible. Well, whatever. Anyway, I do have one book review for you today. The book is Space Unicorn Blues by T.J. Barrie, published in 2018 by Angry Robot. Angry Robot Publishing is known for blending genres, but this one really sent me for a loop. I mean, what the hell do you call a book where a unicorn flies a spaceship? Funny enough, the back of the book says to file it under science fiction, and I don't know, to me it's just funny that has to be listed. Anyway, added to this genre blend is a satirical wit that I enjoyed all the way to the end of the book. The book starts out with our main character, Gary Cobalt, getting out of prison. Gary is a half unicorn, by the way. He is imprisoned for murdering someone. From there, it is non-stop, action-filled carnival of madness filled with zany characters. The main characters include an asshole space cowboy named Jim, who only eats grilled cheese sandwiches, Jenny Parada, a disabled Maori shuttle captain with an acid tongue, and Ricky Tang, a wily trans grifter. Every chapter is more insane than the last. You never know what to expect or what kind of crazy idea our author, T.J. Barrie, will come up with next. I highly suggest this novel to people who love blending genre, satire, and brutal relationships. All right, and that's it for our episode today. Thanks to our guest for spending time discussing her life with us, and thanks to everybody for listening. Don't forget, you can share our podcast with your friends, Facebook, Twitter, That's really the best thing that you could do for us right now. If you've been wondering how else you can support us, check us out on patreon.com/ifthisgoeson. We'd appreciate the help if you're able to contribute. We have multiple tiers you can choose from. I started doing a 5-minute book review recently. There's a couple of those out there. You get a bunch of extras from my old podcast. We are again doing the patron pick, where our Patreon members get to pick someone who's going to come on our show. The last pick was P. Jelly Clark. And actually, that's one of my favorite interviews. So if you're interested in doing something like that, I think that one's $1 a month, which is, that's less than a candy bar these days. So that's it. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next time. This Goes On, Don't Panic is edited by Alan Bailey with production by Sound Maiden. The theme music is by Father Flamethrower. Additional music is by Christopher Snydrosky. And outro music is by Sable Aradia. Intro by Dave Robinson. A special thanks to our guest, SB Divya. Thanks for supporting us, and we'll see you again soon.